When you really think about it, this is basically a crossover episode in the Apothecary Diaries universe. Welcome back to Can We Talk About the Apothecary Diaries in Excruciating Detail, where we overanalyze every single word, meaningful glance, and imperial decree that this story throws our way. My name is Yumna. My current hyperfixation is the Apothecary Diaries, and today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 6, The Garden Party, where the war has begun. Maomao is the diamond of the season, Jinshi is real for once, and there is some attempted sabotage to deal with. This episode picks up pretty much right where the last one left off and chronicles Maomao's experiences at the garden party. But just before we get to the garden party, we see a shot of some ladies in waiting talking poorly about their mistress, someone who we're going to get to know a little better later on in this episode. Then we cut to the garden party being in full swing with all the festivities while Maomao and the other ladies in waiting freeze. In the last video, we talked about how while in theory the garden party should be a fun event for everybody to just kind of relax, mix and mingle, the pavilion staff don't have regular duties to attend to, that in reality it feels much more like an all-out war where there is a lot of preparation and stress involved. And we see this exhibited to us further when Maomao first gets a glimpse at the seating arrangements for this party and immediately notes that it seems like this entire thing is designed to sow tension and competition between the concubines. But how does the seating arrangement for the garden party orchestrate competition between the concubines? Let's go through what it looks like. So to start, we have the emperor front and center above everybody else, very separated from everybody else, which makes sense given his social status. The fact that his word is the word of the heavens. He is not somebody that people are just going to casually talk to or interact with. So it makes sense that he is just front and center on his own. And then to either side of him at a pretty significant distance, you have a spot for the imperial younger brother, and then you have a spot for the empress dowager. This also makes sense because they are members of the imperial family directly. They are the emperor's brother and mother. And then in that same line with more distance, you have the concubines, and you have two sat on the side of the imperial brother and then two sat on the side of the empress dowager. So everybody is kind of sitting in a line, and then you have the concubines, head ladies in waiting, sitting behind them. Now, why is this relevant? So in the last video, we talked about how this garden party almost feels like a battle for public perception within the imperial court, and I think that the seating arrangement is so indicative of that because it really feels like the concubines are there less so as guests and more so as a part of the actual performance, because they're sat in such a way where they are too far away from anybody to make conversation, whether that would be with the other concubines seated or with their ladies in waiting, and there is nothing obscuring them, so people have a full view and have every opportunity to just really size up these women in a way that they typically would not get to because the rear palace is off limits to men. And because of that, any information that these officials are getting about the women in the emperor's garden is either coming from the concubines themselves, writing letters home, talking about what's been happening, or from the eunuchs, or just from other, third, second party sources. And we see how this occurs during the hunt episode in season 2 when at the banquet Gaoxuan gets asked about the happenings of the rear palace as a eunuch who is allowed inside. So the garden party really is this golden opportunity for these officials to get to see these women themselves and make their own judgments about how they feel about them. Because having an understanding of who the top ranking concubines are, who the most viable potential candidates for empress are, is relevant information for these powerful men. And so naturally, when you are put in this type of position where you are sat for hours too far away from anybody to make any kind of idle chit chat or entertaining conversation, it starts to feel less like you are there for festivities and more like you are there to participate in pageantry. And we see how this manifests in little proxy wars between the pavilion staff of these women who are essentially roaming around unsupervised because their bosses, the concubine that they serve and the head lady in waiting, are seated for the festivities. The first proxy proxy war that we see play out is unsurprisingly between Li Hua and Gyokyo's staff when Ying Hua gets upset with the ladies in waiting at the Crystal Pavilion for calling them and their outfits boring. This exchange, along with Li Hua's ladies in waiting making disparaging comments about Maomao, calling her ugly, and saying that because of that she is an embarrassing lady in waiting hire, really highlights a fundamental difference in what is valued at each pavilion when it comes to their employees and the workplace environment and mindset that is cultivated because of that. With the Jade Pavilion valuing things like loyalty, skill, and hard work, and the Crystal Pavilion valuing things like appearances and social status. But I think the most interesting thing about this exchange and the way that Li Hua's ladies in waiting are behaving by calling the Jade Pavilion women boring for their outfits and saying that Maomao is an embarrassing lady in waiting hire because she is ugly, despite the fact that she saved Li Hua's life and brought her back from the brink of death, really speaks to how insular these pavilions are and the groupthink that can emerge because of that. Because when you think about it, these women are only really interacting with each other. That's why I called this a crossover episode earlier in this video, because it's a very rare occurrence for other pavilion staff, especially from the high-ranking roster of concubines, to be speaking to other staff that don't work for their mistress, because these pavilions are really big. They're like huge estates. They have a lot going on. There's a lot of work to do throughout the day, and there really isn't any reason for these women to interact with people that don't work for their respective mistress. And because of that, you are going to foster a level of groupthink where if you disagree with people and you don't maybe get along with the ladies in waiting that you work with, that you live with, that you are around all the time, it is going to be incredibly difficult for you to survive in that environment. It's going to be incredibly difficult for you to be able to get along or find any sense of belonging. And when you couple that with Sheen as a head lady in waiting and the type of regime that she was running and how sinister she is as a person, you get this perfect storm for these women to feel compelled to say these things about a person like Maomao, which to anyone watching is quite perplexing when you consider the fact that, you know, the status quo that they are projecting in this conversation where they're talking about Maomao's looks, where they're talking about, you know, appearances. If they had been allowed to stick to that, if they had been allowed to have that guide Li Hua's care and for Maomao to not have stepped in, Li Hua would have died. She would have died. But that really is the danger here that comes with these very kind of isolated pavilion environments, is that you end up with these women who are not going to interrogate their thoughts, because why would they? That is very against, you know, what would be in their best interests for their survival. And I just think that that's very interesting. And then after this exchange, we see Gyokyo's ladies in waiting reassuring Maomao, letting her know that she should not listen to these bullies, especially Yinghua. She's very vocal here. And I want you to put a pin in that, because there is a conversation to be had later in this video about the differences in how Yinghua is portrayed during the garden party in the light novels versus the anime. And then we see another proxy war play out between Li Shu's ladies in waiting and Adwo's ladies in waiting, where Maomao learns about the very complicated imperial family tree where Li Shu actually used to be the previous emperor's concubine and then left for a little bit and then came back and became the current emperor's concubine, and that Adwo has been the current emperor's concubine for a long time, since before he became emperor, when he was still just the crown prince. Which, coupled with the fact that Maomao also learns how old the Empress Dowager was when she gave birth to the Emperor, is really starting to sow the seeds, set the foundation for everything that we are going to learn, unfortunately, about the previous Emperor in the second season of the show. Then we get Li Shu's first real appearance in the story, and it is very clear to us, the audience, and to Maomao that her pavilion is dysfunctional, with her wearing a hot pink outfit that very much clashes with not only Gyokyo's outfit of crimson, but also with what her ladies in waiting themselves are wearing, which is something that Adwo's pavilion staff were calling them out on earlier when they were having their little proxy war exchange. Earlier, I mentioned how this event, among other things, is a way for officials to get some insight on women in the Emperor's Garden that they would not see otherwise. But likewise, it's also an opportunity for women of different pavilions to size each other up and to get a sense of what each concubine's pavilion is like, what her relationship with her staff is like from a first-hand perspective and not just from the rear palace rumor mill, as we see here with Maomao getting insight on Li Shu in her pavilion that she otherwise probably would not have had. And then we get a very interesting sequence of events, and they're interesting because of how much they differ in the anime versus the light novel. This episode in particular, there are quite a few creative liberties taken when it comes to how the source material was adapted, and we are, of course, going to go through all of it. Now, while the sequence of events is the same, the way that there have been slight tweaks made in the way that the anime adapts them leaves you with a very different feeling than you would have if you were to have just read this scene in the light novel or just watched the anime. So we're going to go through how they play out in the anime first, and then we're going to go through how they play out in the light novel. So in the anime, Maomao notices that the ladies in waiting at the Crystal Pavilion are very cold, and with Lady Gyokyo's permission, she tries to offer them some hand warmers, which they don't take from her because they are scared of Maomao. Maomao then goes back to the Jade Pavilion ladies in waiting and is just hanging out with them, and they all comment on how kind and wonderful she is for offering the Crystal Pavilion women that, despite how they treated her, and also asking Lady Gyokyo for permission first. Like, they just see everything that Maomao just did as wonderful and really indicative of the type of person that she is. Then we start to notice a bunch of men handing out hairpins to women at this garden party, and Yinghua explains that this is how they recruit the best workers, and also there is another hidden meaning behind the hairpins. And Maomao, of course, has no interest in this hidden meaning, and Yinghua gets a little bit frustrated with her because she is trying to gossip over here, and Maomao just has no interest. Maomao then comes across Lee Haku, who hands her a hairpin, and all of the ladies in waiting are quite excited about this and are like, oh, like, can we see what he gave you? And Maomao responds by saying that it was a consolation prize because she noticed that he had a bunch of them on his belt and they were all the same, suggesting that he was just kind of handing these out to everybody so that everybody felt included. And then Lady Li Hua comes over and gives Maomao another hairpin that she sticks into her hair and then just walks away and tells her to have a good day, with her ladies in waiting being very shocked that she has done this. And after she walks away, Guion notes that their mistress, Lady Gyokyo, is likely not going to be very happy about this, and then it just pans to all of the hairpins that Maomao has received throughout the garden party. The rest of the ladies in waiting concur with this statement, and they ask Maomao what she's planning on doing now that she has all these hairpins and is in favor with all of these people. We then cut to Maomao sitting behind Lady Gyokyo, about to commence her poison tasting duties for the day, and we see that she has opted to tuck all of the hairpins into her belt rather than wearing any of them in her hair while she's on the stage. Now, in the light novel, Yinghua actually gets exasperated with Maomao a little bit for trying to offer the Crystal Pavilion ladies in waiting hand warmers, which is quite different from the anime where we just see her expressing genuine praise and admiration for Maomao for doing this despite the way she was mistreated. And while Yinghua's explanation of the hairpins to Maomao in the anime is done in this very matter-of-fact way where she is just in good nature explaining what the customs are at the garden party and is really just trying to have fun with it and have like a fun little gossip moment with Maomao about the romance aspect of it, which obviously Maomao has no interest in, she is quite different in the light novel. In the light novels, her explanation of the hairpins is followed by a snort, and the narration notes that she does this to seem above it all. And the light novel provides further context as to why Yinghua might have this attitude where she wants to seem like she is above it all when it comes to the customs of the garden party, because while in the anime, when she's explaining the hairpins to Maomao, everybody else is also there. In the light novel, Guian and Ailan are actually talking to some military guys, and they are getting their own hairpins from those interactions, which is very different in the anime where the only person from the Jade Pavilion who receives hairpins is Maomao. And so the connotation there seems to be that Yinghua feels a type of way about the fact that she is not being approached in the same way that the other women that she works with are. And then similar to the anime, when Yinghua tries to explain the romantic connotation of the hairpins, she gets shut down because Maomao is not listening to her. However, this is then followed up with Yinghua asking Maomao to give her the hairpin hairpin that she received from Jinshi, which does not happen in the anime. And Maomao responds by saying, well, you're gonna have to play rock, paper, scissors with the other girls for it because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. And they kind of try to do this in the anime at the beginning when Jinshi first gives Maomao the hairpin. In her head, she's like, oh, I could split it, but like how would that work? But here it's actually Yinghua directly asking for this hairpin to be given to her. And obviously both of those things convey very different messages about our respective characters. And then Maomao's internal dialogue during this exchange where Yinghua is asking for the hairpin is also very interesting because it gives us a little bit more insight into what life is like for people that are in service at the rear palace as ladies in waiting. Because part of the reason that Maomao does not care all too much about what happens to this hairpin that Jinshi gave her, or really care that she received it from him to begin with, is because she states in her internal dialogue that she has no interest in kind of moving up in the world of the rear palace and is very set on leaving and going back to her home after her 2-year contract is up. This, coupled with the fact that Yinghua is obviously quite bothered by the fact that she has not been approached in the same way that her co-workers have been, highlights how the rear palace is not only precarious for concubines, but it's also precarious for the women that serve them. Because these ladies in waiting do have to think about their own position and their own interests and the implications that their positions can have on their families that are outside of the rear palace. Because these women are typically the daughters of powerful men that often have their own agenda that they want their children to fulfill, which is a really tough balancing act because while it is important to always be looking out for yourself and your position in the rear palace, you also, as a lady in waiting, need to make sure that you are still serving your mistress and being loyal to her. If you do have loyalty for the concubine that you serve under, which the women of the Jade Pavilion do. But in that serving and being loyal, you also need to be aware of how your lady's social position can change at any time, because concubines can fall into favor and they can also fall out of favor. And as a lady in waiting, you need to think about the implications that will have on you if your mistress suddenly falls out of favor. And so with that in mind, it makes sense that these ladies in waiting want to consider what their position could look like once they are out of service, once they are no longer working as ladies in waiting for a concubine. And then just like in the anime, Mama receives a pin from Li Haku and then she receives one from Lady Li Hua. Now, the way that she receives one from Lady Li Hua and the reactions that people have to it do differ a little bit, and I think that they're pretty notable in 2 ways. In the anime, after Li Hua gives Maomao a pin, one of her ladies in waiting says, "My lady," in this very surprised voice, and Li Hua doesn't really react to it. She just says to Maomao, "We'll be taking our leave now, have a nice day," and she walks away and her pavilion staff follow her, and that is that. Versus in the light novel, it's noted that Li Hua actually chides her staff for their reaction to her giving Maomao a pin. And I feel like they might have changed this just to kind of amp up the surprise and shock factor of the big season 2 reveal with Sheen, but I think that there is something to be said about how the anime makes Li Hua feel a lot more passive as a concubine here than she actually is. The second change being that in the anime, after Li Hua has walked away, Guion comments that Lady Gyokyo is not going to like the amount of hairpins that Maomao has received. And, Ailen kind of asks her, like, oh, like, what are you gonna do about this? But in the light novel, it's actually Yinghua who is the one to speak. And I'm going to read exactly what is said in the light novel in this scene, which is Yinghua stating, can't guess what Lady Gyokyo is going to make of that. Yinghua flicked the protruding hair stick with a look of annoyance, which is obviously quite a dramatic shift and does make you see Yinghua a little bit differently than you would if you have just watched the anime. And then, like in the anime, after all of this happens, Maomao is now seated, ready to do her poison taster duties. And it's noted that she is wearing all of the pins in her belt, but in the light novel, they actually explain why she opted to make this decision, and it's because Yinghua insisted that she not wear any of the hairpins in her hair, because wearing any of the pins would be seen as a slight towards the other 2 benefactors whose pins she did not wear. And then I'm going to read you another direct quote that I think is very interesting, which is that it was this constant need to be aware of how one's actions would impact others that made it so much work to be a lady in waiting. And while these changes are not all that big on their own, altogether they do paint a pretty different picture of who Yinghua is as a character and also what life as a lady in waiting is like in the rear palace. And I think that's quite significant considering the fact that Yinghua, aside from Hongyang, is the lady in waiting that Maomao interacts with and talks to the most. And the ladies in waiting in general are a massive part of the rear palace population. And I think the anime portrays Yinghua with a little bit less nuance and complexity, which I think is really unfortunate because I feel like she is a much more dynamic character during the garden party in the light novel than she is in the anime. And I also think it's unfortunate to lose those little tidbits that really show us how precarious life is for ladies in waiting in the balancing act that they are constantly in to look out for their own interests whilst also thinking about how they're being perceived, whilst also thinking about how what they do could affect their mistress and their loyalty to their mistress, and how stressful and exhausting that process must be. And with how exhausting and stressful it is, it makes sense that Yinghua is acting the way she's acting at this garden party and that she is pretending to be nonchalant and to not care about this, even though it's clear that she really does, because it does matter. It is consequential. And I think it's unfortunate that we lose that here. I think it's unfortunate that in the anime we get, honestly, a little bit more of a one-dimensional portrayal of Yinghua and just a less dynamic understanding of what it's like to be a lady in waiting in general. I still love her. I still love all of the Jade Pavilion staff, but I do think that it's unfortunate that we just get a portrayal of Gyokyo's ladies in waiting and just ladies in waiting in general that feels a little bit heavy-handed in its kind of comedic lightheartedness and takes away some of the depth and darkness that comes with being in this position, in this very precarious place. Now we're back to the garden party, where Maomao is tasting the first item on the menu, which is like an aperitif drink. And this is the first time we see Maomao doing her job as a food taster around a bunch of other food tasters. And while we already knew that she was unconventional in the sense that she has this genuine fascination and excitement about poisons, it really is driven home for us in this scene. When you see how the other tasters wait for her to fully drain her cup before they start to hesitantly drink theirs, and where in her internal dialogue she wishes that somebody had snuck pufferfish guts into, the food that she just had because she just loves the stinging sensation on your tongue. And then we get some more insight into Li Shu and her relationship with her pavilion staff when Maomao is tasting the next dish, which is this vinegar fish vegetable situation, and she notices that the fish in this is different and that this is one of the emperor's favorite dishes, so it wouldn't make sense for them to use a different type of fish. And she notices that the plates have been switched and that Li Shu's poison taster has seemingly switched her, dishes with Lady Gyokyo's to play a prank on her mistress, where it's made clear that Li Shu is being bullied by her staff, and Maomao wishes that she had not seen this, which we are going to get to later. And then we get some more insight into the type of person that Lee Haku is, and there have also been some changes made here from the anime versus the light novel, which we're going to talk about. Really is the reoccurring theme of this video. In the anime, Lee Haku has his eyes closed while the food tasters are doing their job, and he only opens them after one of his peers tells him that there is a poison taster that's like really into it and that he should look and see. And Lee Haku initially doesn't want to. He's like, you may find it enjoyable to look at people terrified while eating, but I personally have other ideas of fun. But in the light novel, Lee Haku does not have his eyes closed. He is watching everything happen, and we get his internal dialogue of him just kind of complaining about the garden party in general. He is not having a great time. It's cold. He doesn't like being around all of these stuffy, full of themselves elites. And he also notes that watching the food tasters be so terrified while doing their jobs does make him lose his appetite. But his eyes aren't closed. He's watching everything, and he notes that, Maomao, this poison taster that he met earlier, is really into it and is like really, really enjoying what she's doing. It's not the biggest change, but I do think that the anime makes Lee Haku come across much more likable and endearing in his very overt, sincere effort to not watch these women eat while they're scared. And then we get, in my opinion, and I think in many people's opinions, one of the most iconic moments of season 1, which is Maomao tasting the next course of this meal, which is a soup, where she's enjoying the soup, and Lee Haku and the other attendees are very enamored with how much she is enjoying tasting this soup, only for her to then very nonchalantly state that this is poison before promptly exiting stage left. Just a stunning performance, truly. And then we get a really important moment between Jinshi and Maomao as far as their dynamic and the progression of it goes, where Jinshi finds Maomao cleaning up after she has coughed up the soup, and he is not in an optimal mood by virtue of the fact that what he feared might happen, which is an incident, happened, and he was not able to stop it because he's still figuring out this wood tablet situation. Maomao, on the other hand, is in the highest of spirits. She thinks it's a beautiful day, even though she was just complaining about how cold it was a couple hours ago, and she is just having a grand old time, smiling real wide because she got to taste poison. And just to quickly say here, I think it is important for us to put a pin in Maomao's enjoyment of pain and just other sensations as we, react to and consider events that are going to happen further on as the story progresses that have not yet been animated. Now, Jinshi, already frustrated by the fact that the garden party has devolved the way it has, is understandably a little bit grated, seeing Maomao so giddy and chipper despite the fact that she was just put in danger on the job, where this poison could have obviously seriously harmed her. So Jinshi grabs her hand and is like, I'm taking you to go see a doctor. And then Maomao decides that she is going to grate at his nerves a little bit more and ask him if she can have the rest of the soup that has poison in it, under the guise of being eager to become a better taster. Jinshi then responds by letting her know that because she was so seemingly nonchalant about the fact that she had just ingested poison, that a minister did not believe that the soup actually had poison in it and decided to eat it for himself, and now he is not in great shape. And obviously him doing that turned the party into an even bigger incident than it already would have been. And then we see Maomao do some really important and relevant introspection. Actually, partly relevant, because the first thing she thinks about is how Jinshi looks a little bit disheveled and how he also has a new hairpin, and thinks about how he might have potentially been engaged indecently before he showed up to drag her away to go see a doctor. The relevant thing that she notes is that he seems to be almost younger and that Maomao prefers him this way. And what we get from this is that she finds it appealing when Jinshi is being real and authentic, because the way that he's acting right now, because he's frustrated, because Maomao was in danger, is much more akin to who he really is when he is not playing this part of Jinshi the eunuch. Now, post throwing up some more, Maomao asks Jinshi if she can have an audience with Lady Lishu and her poison taster. So in this meeting with Lishu, Maomao gives everybody a lesson on what allergies are, as she lifts up Lishu's sleeve to reveal that her arm is covered in hives, a result of her eating the original version of the fish vinegar vegetable dish instead of her modified one. Now, after explaining what allergies are and using herself as an example, because Maomao, we learn, is allergic to buckwheat, which perplexes Jinshi and Gaoshun considering the fact that she eats poison, but then she really drives home the fact that, allergies are a matter of life and death through a veiled but not so veiled threat, where she makes it very clear to Lishu and her poison taster, but more specifically to her poison taster, that Lishu not being able to eat certain things has nothing to do with her likes or dislikes. She then gives the poison taster a set of instructions on what to do if an allergic reaction does occur, and really stresses the high stakes of this situation, and that if somebody were to give Lishu something that they knew she couldn't eat, that she was allergic to, it would be no different from poisoning her. After feeling like the poison taster has been reasonably spooked, her and Lishu leave, and we get another moment between Jinshi and Maomao, which really showcases the amount of comfort that they have in their dynamic now, with Jinshi putting a hand on her shoulder to ask what that was, because it was very clear to us and to everybody watching that this was a veiled but not so veiled threat. And Maomao just kind of brushes his hand off of her shoulder and says that he shouldn't touch her because she is of lowly birth, to which Jinshi responds that you are the only person who has ever used that as an excuse, and Maomao quickly replies with, that's because everybody is just being nice to you. A little fun back and forth, a little banter, something that indicates that these are two people that actually do enjoy chatting with each other. And then we see why Maomao earlier in the story really wishes that she had not seen the poison taster bullying Li Shu. Because obviously Jinshi knows that something is up. Jinshi knows that there is a reason that Maomao wanted the poison taster here when they had this conversation, because Maomao doesn't do things willy-nilly with no intention. But Maomao is purposefully dodging his questions and making an effort to not give him anything specific. And the only thing that she will really give him a clear answer on is that she concurs with him that Li Shu was the actual target of this poison attack and not Gyokyo. In the next episode, we'll learn more about why Maomao did not want to provide any direct answers that incriminated the poison taster. But for now, we are left with her leaving and Jinshi and Gaoshun continuing to talk about the situation with the wooden tablets and who could be behind all of this. And that is all for this episode. How do we feel about the way that the anime went about adapting these chapters of a light novel and the changes that they made to Yinghua, and also to just the discussion around what life is like for ladies in waiting? What were your favorite moments from this episode? And if you were a lady in waiting that had to work at one of the pavilions, which one would you want to work at? Let me know in the comments. And as always, can we talk about that?